Camera one.
This is an oral history interview conducted for the Witness to War Serving a Nation project at Nauset Regional High School on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. For the sake of this interview, please state your full name and the community in which you now reside.
Francis William Preston, at New Wingate Residences, 855 Harwich Road in Brewster.
All right, thank you very much. What was your early life like before joining the military?
My early life?
Yes, growing up.
Kind of varied. I was looking for work when I graduated out of high school. I didn't have hardly any training except I worked in my grandfather's store, meat and grocery store, and kind of grew up in the business. But they didn't have any room for me to work full-time because they had a lot of employees that had been with them for a long time. So I went out looking for other jobs, and I got a job in the bakery, Wonder Bakery, and I left there and after about a year and a half, and I was looking for work and not finding any. This was in the Depression, and I was out of work but collecting unemployment compensation for about 6 months, but I living at home with my mother and father, so it wasn't much of a problem. But I'm sure my mother wanted me to get out of the house and get a job, hanging around too much, you know. So anyway, I eventually got a job in a small factory, and I went from there to Colts Manufacturing, the gun manufacturers, and I stayed there until I was drafted into the Navy. And I was in the Navy 3 years, and by the time I got out of the Navy, I was 26 years old, wow. Not married, and started looking for work again.
So, going back to your childhood, what was your family like? Did you have brothers and sisters?
My what?
Your family. Did you have any siblings?
Children?
Siblings.
My brothers and sisters?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had one older brother and 3 younger sisters, 5 in our family.
How did your family fare during the Depression?
Well, being in the meat and grocery business, we ate pretty good. Mm-hmm. But everything else, we wish we had more, like a bicycle. You know, my brother finally got a bicycle because the school that he had to go to was farther away from the one that I went to. And he got a bicycle, but it was a very simple, inexpensive bicycle, but it did for the purposes that it was intended. And well, he had other toys, but I had a wagon and shared a smaller bike with my 2 older, younger sisters. And so we get along, you know. We didn't think we were poor or anything, when we weren't really, because we had a lot of things that other people didn't have. We didn't have a car. My father would drive the truck from the store home, delivery truck, mm-hmm. And we went to church in that, and Sundays, and sometimes a few other places, but we would like to have had a car in the early days of the Depression. But we did get one later on, second-hand, older car that was, did us for quite a while. And so other things we got by with, we knew we always had good food in our house, and right. We didn't have to go out for ice cream cones or anything like that, although we liked to. But we always had good desserts, good hearty meals, and I'm grateful for that.
Did you have any family members that were involved with the war?
That what?
That were involved with the war? Any other people in your family
What about my work?
that were in the war? Did you have family members in the war?
I'm not getting what you're saying. I'm sorry.
Were there any other members of your family that were involved with the war?
With my work?
No, with the war.
Oh, the war. No, my brother was rejected. He had a spot on his lung because he had pleurisy in his early, and they wouldn't take him in the army. I was the only boy in the family, so the only other boy besides my brother. So I got deferments because I was working in Colts, and I was deferred 2 or 3 times for about 6 months at a time. And I finally got drafted, and then they cut out the deferments. So I was the only one, I guess I was the first one in all my family, brothers and cousins and all that was went into the service.
How did your family respond to you going into service?
How did they respond?
Right.
To what, when I went to service?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, I think my mother was kind of apprehensive, but she was happy I was going into the Navy. She says, well, you'll always have a bed to sleep on anyway, and it's less dangerous than being in the Army or Marines. So she was happy about that. Kind of proud, as a matter of fact.
What was it like to be drafted?
What
was it like to be drafted?
What was it like to be? Well, you get a notice from the some board or something or other that had to do with drafting, and they tell you to report to a certain place, as usually in the post office it was, and report for duty. And I figured it was drafting into the Army. But that time I went was in February of 1943. It was the first time that they drafted into the Navy. Heretofore you had to sign up to go in the Navy, and it was usually 4 years. But when you're drafted, as soon as the war was over, you get discharged at the earliest possible time. So I didn't mind it. When I went, I figured I was going in the Army, and then they told me that I had a choice to go in the Navy if I wanted to. So I did.
What was it like adjusting to life in the Navy?
What was it like?
Adjusting, yes, to the military.
Adjustment? Well, I'd never been in anything like that. In fact, I'd never been away from home hardly, except for a weekend here or there or something like that. So it was all kind of strange to me, but I met some nice people, some nice friends, and had a good friend that I teamed up with, and he was with me all through my naval career, right up until the end. And he was older than me, so he got out, and he was married. So he got out of the Navy probably 2 or 3 months before I did. But it was all right, but it was good. Met some nice people in the Navy, and they had a good duty. Went to diesel training school.
What was training like?
What was training like? It was like going back to school and learning about diesel engines and how they operate. And it was good training. And I studied, and I did everything I could to do the best. I said, whatever I did in my life, I wanted to do the best. And it went true. It was when I went in the Navy, I could do the best that I can with what I'm able to do. And it worked out perfectly. I came out of diesel training school as a second class petty officer. And
What does that mean?
well, it started off with 3 steps in the Navy. Fireman third, fireman second, fireman first. The next step is, and I came out fireman first from regular diesel training school. Then I went to advanced diesel training school because my marks were good. And I came out of advanced school as second class petty officer, which was 2 steps before being chief petty officer.
So, in the Navy, what was an average day like?
Armistice?
Take us through an average day during your service.
I should have put my additional hearing aids in.
No worries. Describe a typical day in the Navy.
In the Navy, oh, okay. Well, at war?
Right.
Or on board ship?
Right. A typical day.
On board ship before we get into the war zone. We have reveille, get up to reveille, and
what is that?
reveille is when you get up in the morning. You'll blow the horn. But in the Navy they ring a bell or a whistle, a boatswain's whistle, and they blow the whistle and they reveille, you get up, time for a rise and shine or something like that. And we'll get up and just go to chow, and then after that there might be some duties to be done, but in our department, in the engineering department, running diesel engines, we were down in the hold on duty, and there wasn't much else to do for our department, so we had a lot of time on our hands. We had time to play cards or go up on top deck and look out at the ocean and other ships in the convoy or whatever.
So, how did you interact with people during this time?
How did I react?
Interact with other people.
Oh, good. I got along good with just about everybody. Yeah, there were a few that were a little hard to get along with, but I got along with just about everybody.
Could you describe the relationships that you formed during this time?
Mama?
Describe the relationships that you formed.
You drop your voice and I don't get the end of it.
Sorry. What type of relationships did you form in your service?
What?
Relationships with people.
Oh.
That.
Well, being a petty officer, I had a rank above most of the people who did the work. Seamen, or they call them firemen in the engineering department. And so I was one of the ones that give them orders, and they don't take the orders except from superior officers.
Mm-hmm. Can you describe your happiest moment of the war?
Happiest moment of the war? I'd say probably when the war was over. We were out in the Pacific. We had heard that a treaty was about to be signed by the Japanese. It's in the Pacific. And we were happy that peace was coming at last, and we didn't have to worry about being torpedoed or anything like that. It made a better feeling for everybody.
What was the most memorable place that you visited during your service?
Memorable place? I'd say Japan. After the war, of course.
What was it like there?
Well, the Japanese people, for the most part, were glad the war was over. It was a terrific tragedy for them when they dropped the A-bomb on Nagasaki and the other city. Many people were killed, and I hated to see that, but it ended the war anyway.
Describe your darkest memory of the war.
The saddest moment? I think probably when the ship I sailed on went down the Mississippi River, picked it up in Evansville, Indiana, and sailed down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. I had relatives in New Orleans. Aunt and uncle were there, and I went to see them. And when I was there was a wise woman there, an older woman, that told my aunt, she says, that boy misses his mother. And she says, my aunt said, how do you know? I can tell. So she did. She called my mother, my aunt. And we were going back to the ship after our liberty of a couple of days. And we were going to go out to, we had been out on what they call a shakedown cruise to see if everything's going to stay in place on a ship. And we came back to New Orleans, and we were going to be there for 2 or 3 days while they looked over the ship and see if everything was all right. And by that time, my mother and father came down to New Orleans. So I had a couple of days with them before I left. And then, when it came time to go, my mother and father and my aunt and uncle drove me down to the ship. And so when I got by, I said goodbye to my mother and father, my aunt and uncle. And I turned around and went towards the ship. My mother says, you didn't turn around when you got near the ship. Why did you? I says, because I was afraid I might go back. So I don't know if I was or not, but I just didn't want to break down or anything in front of them, so I just went aboard ship. And then we sailed through the Panama Canal and out to the Pacific. So that was kind of sad, leaving them, and not wondering if I was going to come back or not, but came back without a scratch.
So during your service, how did you maintain contact with your loved ones?
With what?
With your loved ones.
Couldn't out in the Pacific, no way. Just write letters. I wrote letters quite frequently, and my mother answered my letters. But being out at sea, we couldn't get the mail, but they sent it to probably the next place we were at, where there was one of our offices, what do you call it, a base. And so you get probably 3 or 4 or 5 letters at a time. And then so we'd have to sit down, if I already got nothing else to do, and write more letters to my mother and father. And sometimes an aunt or an uncle, or not an uncle, but an aunt would write to me, and I'd have to answer that. And my sister, so forth.
Earlier you talked about life on the ship. So earlier you mentioned life aboard the Navy ship.
Yeah.
Could you tell us what a battle in the Navy was like?
What was like?
A battle in the Navy.
A battle? Well, our ship was a landing ship, and it had a flat bottom. And we used to go right up on the beach with the ship. Opened the bar doors like this, no, like this, and tanks would go out into the island. And at first it was kind of scary. We didn't know what to expect, you know. So the first one was a big one of the larger islands out there. I mean, never even heard of it, but Anahuac was the name of it. And another one was, shortly after, was Kwajalein. And those two islands were big ones. And they're kind of scary. A lot of shooting going on. Or we were being way down in the bottom of the ship, in the engine room, where the engines were. And we didn't know what was going on until at the end of the day, we'd come up or after our watch was over, and we talked to, we had some soldiers, the Army men, and we had Marines at one time too, and they were manning the tanks that went out into the enemy territory. And we talked with them about things, and we had met some fellows that never came back, and we hadn't known very long, but, you know, it was nice to have a friendship with them, but kind of sad to see that they didn't come back, so it was good and bad. It was the way things were in the war.
Sorry. Now, could you go into more detail about the relationships you described earlier?
About what?
The relationships you formed.
Relationship? Between who? The crew members or the family or what?
Yeah, your fellow crew members.
Well, as I said, I got along with just about everybody.
Right.
And there were a couple that were kind of hard to get along with, but I didn't ignore them or anything like that. But I got, you know, I had a good relationship, I'd say, with just about everybody.
Were there any relationships that you maintained after you returned?
With just one friend, you showed him, and you had that picture of in the white uniform. The short one was my buddy.
This one?
Yeah, the one on the left was my buddy. And he lived up in Massachusetts, and I lived in Connecticut. And I saw him 2 or 3 times after that.
Wow.
But he was married, and I was looked for a wife, and eventually got a wife and got married. And we kind of separated a little bit, but we kept in contact with each other, like Christmas cards and stuff like that.
So I understand you grew up in Hartford, Connecticut?
Yeah.
How did you end up on Cape Cod after your service?
I was between jobs there. Well, I had a job. I was working for a chain store in Connecticut, and they didn't like the way I was working, so they weren't very fussy, and I was. And so I got a job in an independent store, and I was doing very well there, but it was, I'd say 30 miles from home, and I had to go through heavy traffic to get to my place where I lived. I lived in a town outside of Hartford, town of Wethersfield, and so I was talking about it with my wife, and she says, well, why don't you try Cape Cod? She says, we have always gone there for vacations, and maybe if we get a job there, maybe we could move up there. So I did. Came to Cape Cod. First place I went to, shoop, had a job right like that.
Was it difficult returning to society and adjusting to society after your service?
No, very easy. Had no problems. I tried going to college, but my mother got sick, and my younger sister was married, and she moved out of town. The younger sister was going to school yet, and my brother was a traveling salesman. So there was nobody to take care of my mother. So I said, well, I'll do it. So I stayed home, and I got the meals for my mother and father, myself, and my sister too. And that's why I began to learn how to cook. Home cooking, that is. I wouldn't ever be a cook in a restaurant. But I took care of my mother because there was nobody else to do it. So I quit school. And I'm not really sorry that I did, because I liked some of it, but I didn't like all of it. And so I then after a while, after I got married, my mother had recuperated, and I got married, and I started to go to night school, and then the family started to come around, babies and so forth, and I'd come home from work, and I'd go to night school, and I wouldn't have much. Couldn't have much to do with the family, but I kind of missed that. So I said, this isn't too good. I'm not learning too much. It's okay, but I'd rather not go to school and be home with my family.
Could you describe your
did.
family?
Huh?
Could you describe your family after the war? You mentioned you had children?
I had 5 children.
Wow. What was that like?
Well, I enjoyed them. I enjoyed them very much. My wife had physical problems. It was drinking, to be honest with you. And I just tried to make it right for her to stop drinking. And she would go to AA, and I would go to Al-Anon, and she would, but she was just there among those present. She didn't participate in things that they were supposed to do. They have a book about that thick. Tells all about how to recover from alcoholism.
Right.
Well, she didn't read it very much, and she should have. I tried to make it so that she could, and she was hospitalized many times because of her drinking. She got so bad that she couldn't control herself. She didn't do anything. She'd have been in more hospitals than I had been in all my life, 10 times more. Anyway, I had to try to keep the family together as they were growing up. Their children were in high school, and especially the two older girls were very helpful in keeping the household going. There was a younger sister and a brother, and so I got by okay. And eventually my wife died. By that time the kids were grown up and out of school. So I had one younger son who was about 10 years old, 8 or 10 years old when my wife died. And no, the older kids were all working and self-supporting. So I was talking to my sister who lived in California. She says, why don't you come out here, you can get a job, and when your son isn't, when Robert's in school, he can come home to my house, and you can come and get him later and go to your house. I said, well, sounds like a good idea. So I did. We went there, and two of my children went with me. They got out there, my son and my youngest daughter. They went out there with me, and they couldn't get jobs out there. So they came back to Massachusetts, and I stayed there, and I got married out there. But it was the wrong thing to do. It was the wrong marriage, and it didn't last very long. So I came back after, I was there 2 years, and I came back. I'm glad to get back. So, here I am.
How has the military service affected you?
How many months?
How has your service affected you, and what have you taken away from it?
Well, the Navy, I just loved it. I loved being in it. And it was inconvenient because I was away from the family. My mother and father were in good health, but I don't like being with my mother and father. I liked my mother. I liked to be home with her, and I loved working with my father in the grocery store. And it was a wonderful relationship all around between my mother and father and me. So I got along with my brothers and sisters, especially my youngest sister. She was in well, I got a picture of her over there.
So what have you taken away from this that affects your life now?
Now? Well, I'm here. My family's out there, but I'm in touch with them. I have two sons, one in Harwich and one in Chatham. And anytime I need anything, if it's important, I can call on them. And they would do things at their convenience when they could. But my son, my younger son, has a pet supply store in West Harwich. And my older son worked for a fisherman's supply store in Chatham. And full-time jobs. And all right, my oldest daughter, she and her husband have a bed and breakfast place in Sandwich. In the summertime, she's so busy, she can't come see me. In the wintertime, she was being able to come and see me, but 3 years ago, her husband had 3 strokes, one after another. And he's in a wheelchair all the time now, still recuperating from trying to get better. But it's a slow process.
So we have enough time for about one more question. Do you have any advice? What advice would you give to someone who was thinking about joining the Navy now?
And advice?
Yes.
Think go in the Navy? Go. Yeah, if you want to go in the Navy, I think it's the best service, the best one, the cleanest, and you know, you always have a bed, as my mother used to say, and it's good. It's tough sometimes. There may be better opportunities for future employment by learning something in the Army or Marines or something. But the Navy is limited to what you can do on board ship.
Right.
Most of the time.
All right. Thank you very much for talking to us today, Mr. Preston.
It's my pleasure. I hope I have done well. I don't know.
Yes, thank you very much.
I enjoyed doing it. Thank you.